And right now I'm going to talk about the theoretical background and how we change the existing mindfulness to make it suitable for people with autism. And I'm going to go into a little bit into distress in autism, treatment options, and how mindfulness might be interesting in theory and in clinical practice. And at the end, a bit of the research that we've done on this subject. So what we see is that people with autism often experience more distress than other people, which is not strange because of their sensory sensitivity. Problems filtering all the sensory stimuli that are in the world. The difficulty with change, of course. And what we know from research is that depression and anxiety happen more in people with autism, especially the higher the intelligence, the higher the chance on depression, which is understandable because intelligent people with autism often notice how hard it is and that they have many qualities, but it's difficult to get a job that suits with the qualities. And that it's difficult to recognize where your boundaries are and to recognize stress signals. When am I stressed? I've got a nice picture of that. What can be signals of being stressed, which is different in anyone? What we also see is rumination, and then not about food, but rumination in the sense of not being able to stop thinking. And it's not always even necessarily negative thoughts, sometimes just normal thoughts. But the brain remains active until all details fit. And that's a long and straining process often. And this has to do with the detailed information processing. And often when people are stressed, people with autism, the detailed information processing becomes more and more, which is this photo of. You get more perfectionistic. And social information can also be difficult to, and you can ruminate about that. How does the social world work? And what we often see is that the brain remains active, which can cause sleeping problems. When you want to sleep, but your brain is still so active, then you can't find the relaxation or the rest to fall asleep. So if we look at treatment options for the distress, then what we used to do from guidance perspective is helping. And that can be very good. It can be good to adjust the environment to make it more autism friendly, or to explain about autism, what it is and how it influences you, or structure the environment. So these things all help. But what we lack is to help people with autism to acquire skills to cope themselves, so that you can do it yourself, get the stress levels down. And if that works out, if you have strategies that can help you get the stress down, then you're more in control over your own well-being. And that's a good thing, that you don't need the guidance or the clinicians, but you can do it yourself. And that's why we were thinking about the mindfulness, to teach people strategies to release the stress themselves. And talking about how to reduce distress, what techniques can you use? There are skills that are considered healthy. Healthy coping skills in general are number one, talk about it. When there's a problem, talk about it. Talk with friends, with your partner, just talk about it. That helps. And if that doesn't work out, you can always go on holiday or seek some entertainment. So this is a nice picture. So there are various strategies that are considered helpful. But what we know about talking about problems is for people with autism that often gives only more distress. And that's not so strange, because when you're stressed out, if you then have to give words to feelings, make eye contact, listen to the other person, often that's not possible when you're already stressed out. And we also see that in the research there are studies that show that talking about problems does not help people with autism. And going on holiday only increases sensory stimuli. So if people say, oh, go do something nice for yourself, or oh, do something relaxing, that's a change of plan. And a change of plan is a change of your daily routine, and it increases the sensory stimuli. So that's also often not an option. So what we can say is that people with autism often have less coping strategies to deal with stress. And that's why we thought maybe meditation can be a possibility to cope with stress. And what we do, very practical, is we teach people with autism 10 different meditations. It's meditation on the breath, a thinking meditation, walking meditation, and some other meditations. There are long meditations, there are short meditations in which you sit or lie down or walk. We can do them individually or in a group. And in a group, it's a 9-week training. On the internet, I found a nice picture about group mindfulness that I found nice for here. But what we do in general is together we examine which meditation technique suits best. That's all we do. We teach the techniques, and together we examine which one is good for you and which one isn't. That's the core. That's also what we practice in the workshops. And if you can find these techniques, then they can help people. I've brought some film fragments of John, who did the mindfulness in our groups. He has Asperger's and has been diagnosed later in life. And he had problems at work with aggression regulation, or when things went differently than expected. So that gave him a lot of stress. And problems at home in his relationship. And I'm going to show you a few film fragments, and this is the first. And in this one, I asked him which meditations help you with what. So at the end of this training that we do with people with autism, they're often able to express themselves which meditations help at what moment and for what. So for us, the advantage of mindfulness is that recognizing and talking about thoughts and feelings is not essential. And that's nice for people with autism, because it's often difficult to talk about what you feel. And these are skills that can be learned and used, so that's easy, and you can practice it everywhere. And that's nice. We have the fragments on the internet, and people can take them on the bus, or I know that John practices them on the bus, and that's nice. You can do it everywhere. A little bit about the theory of mindfulness is what important is the doing mode versus the being mode. And this might be an example. Being at a party has a lot of sensory stimuli, and it can be hard for people with autism. And then sometimes they feel like, oh, I need rest being at home. And often the brain gets into a doing mode, thinking, there are too many stimuli, I can't handle this, I'll be exhausted. And if you can get your brain more in the being mode, more rest in the brain, that can help to still be at the party, but be more at rest. And as I explained in the workshop, sometimes it's enough to keep following the breath for a while, and then be less worried by all the things that go on around you. So this is a bit of an example of left the being mode and right the doing mode. Is your brain active, or is your brain more in rest? And what we see in the being mode is more about accepting that things are the way they are. And you don't have to solve anything, you don't have to change anything. And it's also about being kind to yourself. That's what we also talked about in the workshops, that people with autism can be very hard for themselves. And it can be so good if they're a little bit more kind to themselves. And that often also gives more rest and gets you out of this negative spiral of thoughts. When I explain about the being mode and the doing mode, I often get the question, can I do something in the being mode? Or, very Dutch, can I ride a bike in the being mode? And then I explain you can ride a bike in the doing mode, and that's riding the bike and thinking about work and what you're going to do tomorrow and worry about things. But if you ride the bike in the being mode, your brain is in rest and you're only feeling your muscles and you're feeling the wind in your hair. But that's all, just feeling what there is and the mind being in rest. So that makes all the difference. So what about clinical practice? What we aim to do is self-regulation of stress level, that you regulate what the stress levels are. And for many people with autism, it's trying to find a balance between getting sensory stimuli and recovery from it. And what meditation can do is that it gives a moment of rest for the mind, which is nice, that you worry less, and that gives room for new stimuli. And some people even call it resetting my brain, that the brain gets ready to get new information in. It's also about acceptance. It's not only about having just a moment of not thinking or thinking less. It's also about acceptance. Many people fight against how the world is and how they want it to be. And that's not only for autism. We all have our ideas of the ideal world. And perfectionism can be a burden in that sense. And if you can learn to let go of thoughts, in workshops we did the thinking meditation, that thoughts can just go by, and that's what thoughts do. You don't have to take them too seriously, they just go by. That can help to accept that there are things that are not perfect, but they go by. Another piece of film, I asked John, what helped you most during the mindfulness? That's so good. If you can help people with autism to be a little bit more mild and accepting, then it's, well, the world is a bit nicer then. So what can be contraindications when not to do mindfulness for people with autism? When there's too little time to practice, mindfulness and meditation is something that you need to learn and need to practice at home. When someone has no time, then we usually don't do that. Or in a very stressful period, when the period is too stressful, it can be difficult to practice. And it's easier to start to learn it in a period that's a little bit less stressful. Then you have the energy to learn it so that you can use it when there is a lot of stress. Or when there's no motivation for mindfulness. I always like people to want it themselves. So as I said in the workshop, that sometimes with adolescents, they don't like the word meditation or mindfulness. So then what I say is we've got this technique that helps some people with autism to cope with stress. So if you ever want to try it, you know where to find me. So they make the choice and not I. And that works better, I think. And when there's severe depression, I think you should start with other treatment, and then later on mindfulness might be a possibility. Good motivation, people who want to let go of thoughts that are worrying or ruminating a lot. To sleep better, that's said most by people with autism, that the meditations help them to fall asleep when they want to. To be better in contact with their physical boundaries when they go over them, for example at work. Having a more relaxed mind and being less stressed. These are motivations that are often good to start with mindfulness. So I'd like to say something about the adjustments that we did, because when we started with mindfulness, we noticed that the language that is often used in meditation is not very suitable for autism. I've got a language of an example for dry hair. And when we did the mindfulness, we asked the first groups, give us feedback on how we can do it better. So we got a lot of feedback, and that made the mindfulness the way it is now, and I think that's only good. So I'm giving you a few examples of things that I did wrong, that I learned from. At first I said, listen to the silence, but then someone in the group said, but you can't hear the silence. So how can you listen to it? So we now say experience the silence, which is better. Or focus on the space between your toes, but how can you focus on something that doesn't exist? So these are things that are said in the regular mindfulness that we changed. Or imagine traveling through your arm from your shoulder to your hand. And then there was someone in the group who said, I can't do that, so I went on the outside. So, yeah. So the whole thing of movement, I think many people can't feel this sort of movement. So everything that I can't feel, I'm not going to say to people with autism to feel. I often said, see if you can feel where. But the word see can give a clue to open your eyes. Or people think, oh, but Annelies doesn't mean it like that. And she means something. But then they're already in a doing mode because they have to translate my language. And I don't want that. When I had the mindfulness, I had to breathe through a hole in my head like a dolphin. We didn't do that. I couldn't do that, so I'm not going to do it to other people. And the last one is, that's often said in meditation, you can feel the breath going down to your toes. And then one of our people said, but my lungs end here. How can it go to the toes? So we learned that to adjust our language. And that makes it more accessible. And in the end, we've rewritten the whole regular mindfulness training together with people with autism and turned it into a book. And I wrote a chapter, and then I would send it to 2 people with autism, and then I would get it back full of remarks, and then I would change the remarks. And that way we built the book together. And then the publisher thought that would be a nice cover. And I thought, no, that doesn't feel right. But then this man said, but men are more eager to buy a book when there's a woman on the cover. So I said, not our men. So I emailed this to all the men that we've had in our mindfulness group. And we've got remarks like, but this is a woman's magazine. I'm not going to buy that. And one of the men said, I do not understand the expression of this lady, and further, I don't understand where this hair comes from, why it's there. And that man said, can't it just be someone on the beach, because that's much more silent. So that's what the publisher did. I don't know where the dog comes from. Sometimes we get questions about that. When does the dog come in? And it's now in a German version without the dog, so that's better. But that's nice. If you build it up together, at the end you get something that's good for people with autism. So a little bit about the research. We did a randomized controlled trial. So we compared people with autism who would get the mindfulness with people with autism who would receive a standard treatment. And we did the mindfulness with people with ASD, with anxiety or depression or sleeping problems or worries. And what we saw is that for the depression, and then the blue is the people who did the mindfulness and the gray is the control group, is that it helped to get the depression down and the anxiety, and especially the rumination. And the rumination led to the depression and anxiety go down, and that led to more positive effect. So we were very happy to see in our results what the people told us themselves. So that was very nice. We also looked after 3 months and after the training. That was a little bit more people, and we had a little bit more that we measured, and we also saw that they still had less sleeping problems, less physical problems, less anxiety, depression and worry. So we were very happy that the effect didn't disappear when we stopped the training, that it went on. So that's, I think, important that what you do generalizes. And as I showed in the workshops, it's very important that you ask the right questions for it to generalize, but then it can still be there after a while. So what did people say themselves? Most comments that we had is, it helps me to sleep better. That's what we heard most from people. When ruminating or thinking in bed, change your focus to the breath or to the body, and then it's easier to fall asleep. There are also people who said it's easier to let go of thoughts, to see it like thoughts just going by instead of thoughts that I have to do something with. Some people saying being less bothered by sounds, and there's also meditation oriented on sounds, to let sounds just be there and be less bothered by them. Better recognition of physical boundaries was what people said, and that it can help to recover from stress. So we were very happy that the things that we aimed for, that they said that it works for that. I have an example of John where he talks about how meditation helps him in a certain situation. So I'm going to show that to you. What he actually says is he uses the short meditation, and that's what we see often, to examine how he feels, because it's not automatically that he knows how he feels after a day of work. He uses a short meditation to scan how he feels, and if he then discovers that he's too stressed out, then he'll do a longer meditation at home. So this examining is very important because it gives you a moment to see how you're doing. And be more friendly towards themselves. That's last but very important, because if you're more friendly to yourself, that's a big thing for people with autism. There's always, we also saw that in the groups there's always someone who says, this is not for me. I don't like meditation, it doesn't help me. And that's okay. I always say it up front in the groups, there's always someone who doesn't benefit. We know that. I did have a group that went really well, and people were all enthusiastic, and then someone said, but that's not possible, because there's always someone who doesn't benefit. So who is it? Some bit more... very recently, we looked at a very small study at the effects on executive functions, only in 9 adults with autism spectrum disorder. And we used the brief, that's an instrument to measure the executive functions like planning or flexibility. And we did that before and after the training, and we didn't look at the long-term effects, and we didn't have a control group, but I find it interesting what we found, because what we saw was that the inhibition, the flexibility, and the emotional control got better after the mindfulness. And we saw the same for working memory, organization, planning, and the ability to initiate new things. And I don't think that mindfulness helps directly with the executive functioning. But what I think is that if you do mindfulness, you have more rest in your mind. And if you have more peace of mind, you have more room to be flexible, to plan, etc. So this more relaxed mind is very important also for other things. And that's a bit what Peter said as well, that having more room in your brain gives opportunities to do things that sometimes you can't. So in short, with the research we've done, we think that mindfulness is promising, although there's more research necessary. But the most important thing I find is that it gives the control back to people with autism who can use the skills themselves to get more peace of mind, and also to increase acceptance of thoughts, that there are thoughts and they will go by and they don't have to bother me. And that the more peace of mind can sometimes also improve the executive functioning. One more film fragment of John, where I asked him, what do you think is the difference before and after the mindfulness? So he says the same as we saw in our research, that because the stress goes down, there's more room to do the things that are necessary at work or be in your relationship. So I'd like to end with an anecdote, something that happened in one of the groups. Is that a group with mostly men with autism, and one of the men asked, what is a mantra? And we usually don't do the mantras, but I try to explain. So I said to him, that's a sentence that you repeat in your mind when you're looking for rest. And then another man in the group said, but when I need rest, I'd rather picture a beautiful woman. And then this first man said, oh, a womantra. So that's one of the nice moments. That's one of the reasons why I like working with people with autism. So, thank you for listening. I think we have we do have some time for questions.